knows well and conduct a questioned Q&A. This speech will be accompanied by a few PowerPoint slides as well. Brian Perry.
Okay, I need the screen sharing enabled, please. When you think of dark fantasy, maybe you think of the writings of Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe comes to mind. Perhaps you think of Rod Serling, Alfred Hitchcock, or even Ray Bradbury. But if you talk to people who actually write horror, read dark fantasy, Howard Phillips Lovecraft's name comes up very frequently as a person who ranks very high. On Ranker, he's ranked number 3 behind Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 different aspects of Lovecraft's work. I'm going to give a brief bio. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of his stories. I can't go into all of them. I'm going to talk about his influence on pop culture, a few criticisms of his work that have come up in recent years, and I'll make a brief statement about his atheism, because this is a free thought club and this is as appropriate to what HP Lovecraft. Lovecraft was born August 20th, 1890 and died March 15th in 1937. He was born in Massachusetts and lived most of his childhood in Providence, Rhode Island. His father was taken away to the Butler Asylum at the age of 2 because he contracted syphilis on a business trip to Chicago. And so he didn't really know his father very well. And for the first 8 or 9 years of his life, he lived in his grandfather's mansion, and he was a precocious reader. And he read many of the books in his grandfather's library before his grandfather went bankrupt and they had to move into a much poorer housing. He started to write poetry and fiction at a very early age. He had a major interest in astronomy, literature, and chemistry, especially. And he even wrote a column in the Providence newspaper for a time, even as a child. He had a nervous disposition, though, and he would miss school periodically to the point where he could not finish high school. He had a precarious relationship with his mother, and his mother often would say that he was hideous. And so as an adult, he would hide his face often for many years, and he was said to be a recluse. Eventually, his mother also ended up in the Butler Asylum and ended up dying about the time Lovecraft was 30. About the age of 30, Lovecraft joined the Amateur Press Association, and this helped his writing out and also his social life. He actually made many friends in the Amateur Press Association. He would attend conventions. And he was even married for a couple of years to a woman named Sonia Green, but the marriage was a disaster, and in New York City didn't work out too well for him. One incident had him having all his clothes stolen out of his apartment in Brooklyn, and also he could never really find a job, a full-time job. His only real job was writing. Lovecraft began to submit weird tales and other pulp magazines. He would often be rejected by the editors, but he would rewrite the tales, and he would have some modest success in magazines like Weird Tales and Astounding Tales and Amazing Stories. His most prolific period was after 1926, when he was separated from his wife Sonia, and he began to write many of the key tales of what's called the Cthulhu mythos. He would write 75,000 plus letters in his lifetime. Many of his letters are in the John Hay Library at Brown University. His literary club was also known as the Calum Club. He would often travel up and down the East Coast. He often traveled as cheaply as possible, would often eat baked beans and cheese. And this would later, he would write 66 stories, one novel, and a book on Quebec. He also wrote hundreds of poems, essays, and a book called Supernatural Horror and Literature. He died March 15th, 1937 of intestinal cancer and Bright's disease. It was suggested that it's because of his poor diet that this happened to him. And he also denied that he was ill and did not want to go to the hospital. His gravestone epigram reads, "I am Providence." Some of his key stories, and these are some of the key ones. I didn't mention all of them. Cool Air, The Rats in the Walls, The Color Out of Space, his best story. The Call of Cthulhu, the keystone story to the Cthulhu mythos. At the Mountains of Madness, another keystone story. The Whisperer in Darkness, The Dunwich Horror, The Dreams in the Witch House, Pickman's Model, which was made into a TV show, I believe. The Shadow over Innsmouth, The Shadow Out of Time, The Thing on the Doorstep, and The Honor of the Dark, which was written with the lead character being Robert Blake, who was actually supposedly Robert Bloch, the person who did Psycho. The Cthulhu mythos was what he best known for in the dark fantasy community. It was a series of alien entities, essentially. Some of the key ones are Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Hastur, Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, and many other ones that were made up by people whom he invited to add to the mythos. The Call of Cthulhu is one of his key tales. The narrator, Thurston, pieces through the notes of his deceased uncle through happenings at an archaeological convention in an article from Australia to piece together the story. Whomever encounters Cthulhu or the cult of Cthulhu appears to be doomed. In the story, the Necronomicon is mentioned, the famous Grimoire, as well as the famous couplet, "That which is dead can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." And this is the first story to use the term the Great Old Ones. The Color Out of Space is probably one of Lovecraft's best stories, and doesn't make any mention of any entities. It's about an asteroid or meteorite that lands on a farm and has weird effects. It impacts the Gardner family, in the whole valley in a rural part of western Massachusetts. This is a story that also has effects. I've talked to people that the trees moving without anything being visible. This is one of the few stories that actually I've talked to that scared people. Like I remember talking to Ruth Castle, one person I'd known from Toastmasters for many years, and she was scared of this story. And At the Bounds of Madness is the other one of the better known tales, which was influenced by the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a story of exploration where a team from Miskatonic University goes down to the Antarctic, discovers a race of beings in the ice. In the story, we see a struggle of human versus nature as well, where the weather is bitter cold like it is today, and they're struggling to use the technology of that time. The story was written in about 1930, and airplanes were still a fairly new technology. A great city of the elder things is discovered in Lovecraft gives a rudimentary history of the earth. Another race of Shagas is also discovered, which are used in other stories, and they're more like a crawling eye. This is a tale of the Antarctic is thus a tale of scientific discovery as much as dark fantasy. It actually could be read as a science fiction tale, and it has been read that way. Some criticisms of Lovecraft. It is said that Lovecraft often uses purple prose to describe things. He would use adjectives such as eldritch quite often, or gibbous, moon is often used, and batrachian, for example, or cyclopean is another really very common description of a city, for example. He is said to have been prejudiced, especially his view on foreigners tainted some of his stories. He's very xenophobic in some of the stories. His stories aren't really scary, but more atmospheric. And it could be said that he did not really have very many sympathetic female characters, if any. Most of his characters were men in the stories. Pop culture influence. First, the movies. Some of the movies were Reanimator from 1985, The Danish Horror from 1970, Dagon from 2008, Die Monster Die from 1968, and At the Mouth of Madness from about 1995. And there were many, many, many other movies written using the Lovecraft mythos and the influence of HP Lovecraft. There were also television programs, such as the Night Gallery I mentioned, the Pickman's Model. Old radio shows would often use these tropes. Role-playing games, such as Call of Cthulhu, emerged. Board games from Fantasy Flight here in Roseville, including Arkham Horror, and a collectible card game I've had called Mythos. Many various video games have used him. He influenced many authors, including Robert Bloch, Stephen King, Guillermo del Toro, who did movies like Hellboy, Ramsey Campbell, and Joyce Carol Oates. Lovecraft was an atheist. And I'll briefly mention that he was a materialist and did not believe in any of the beings that were mentioned in his stories or the books. He did not often mention that he was an atheist. Summary: Lovecraft was an influential author, but it is subjective opinion to say that someone was the best. He certainly is one of my favorite authors. Lovecraft lived a troubled childhood, though his talent for writing was unmistakable. Lovecraft wrote many stories and influenced pop culture in ways that would never have envisioned when he was alive. Lovecraft is the subject of continuous study by academics, fandom, and continues to be an influence on many authors. I've got dozens of books in my library just on HP Lovecraft. I got a huge biography here called The Light. I can show you. Okay, now I will do a Q&A.
All right. You have spoken about how influential HP Lovecraft has been. Can you tell us more about what those influences are? Who were the disciples who followed him? Are there any name for the school of literature that he developed?
The school of literature that he developed is called it is called the Cthulhu Mythos. It's called the Lovecraft Library. There are people like me who followed him. I'm actually one of the people who followed him. But I mentioned Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch was one of the people that was one of his correspondents and wrote him for many years and he wrote Psycho, for example. You're familiar with Psycho. Another person was Stephen King. Stephen King was inspired to write by reading the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. Another man by the name of Brian Lumley from Great Britain was inspired by him and wrote many, many novels and stories because Ramsey Campbell, a man I met back in the late 90s, who came to my convention, Arcana, also wrote many novels and followed his stories. Some local authors included Jack Koblis, who was a guy named Philip Raymond, who went to my convention for years. So I met many of these people who followed H.P. Lovecraft. And we had Arcana for 25 years, or over 20 years. I started going in 96.
I have a question. Your subtitle to the title of your speech is "The Best Horror Author of the 20th Century?" ? And you said he was ranked third by some standard. What would make one of these gentlemen better than the others? How would someone elevate to be number one?
Well, one of the key standards could be book sales. Lovecraft is not qualified based on book sales. He's ranked high in influence based on all the academics that study him. He's got editions of Penguin. I forgot to bring this up, but Penguin published a couple of his books or story collections. And originally, Arkham House was created by a man named Donald Wandre from St. Paul here and a man named August Derleth from Sauk City, Wisconsin. And they after he died, Lovecraft was a relatively obscure author, and they created a book called The Outsider and Others. Now, by book sales, Stephen King would clearly be the winner in that regard. Edgar Allan Poe has probably got the best name recognition of any horror author that ever lived, I believe. I mean, even my own father was reading Poe, and he wasn't a horror fan. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.